You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. The greater Tampa Bay region is under a hurricane watch and storm surge watch, and you can get the latest information about Helene, forecast to become a major hurricane in the Gulf, on 89.7 FM and WUSF.org. But for now, it's time to talk politics. It's election season, and if you're a new voter, it may be intimidating trying to decipher the flood of campaign ads, figure out your ballot, or even know who it is you're being asked to vote for. Over the next 30 minutes, you're going to hear from two people who pay close attention to elections. Tara Newsom and Alex Mahadevan are guests on Florida Matters Elections podcast, Our Changing State, Vote 2024. They're here for you, explaining how to get involved in the political process and make your vote count, and how you can be a savvy news consumer during election season. Tara Newsom's a professor of government and civic learning at St. Petersburg College, and she's been talking with students about issues they think are important.
You know, young voters have this idea that they should be represented, and that's an idea that we all share. They've been underrepresented in almost all elections, usually 20 to 30 points behind the average voter. In this election, they recognize that democracy, their reproductive freedoms, climate change, foreign policy is all on the ballot. And so they're really leaning in and understanding they need to participate in the democratic process, they need to be represented, and they're also starting to understand the reality that they comprise 44% of the electorate. Gen Z and Gen Y are a large portion of the electorate, and they are starting to feel their own oats and want to make an impact.
You'll hear more from Newsom in about 15 minutes. But first, media organisations are shrinking, and trust in the media is slipping. So where do you turn for election coverage? Alex Mahadevan is the director of MediaWise at Poynter, which aims to empower people like you with media literacy skills to identify misinformation. Alex explains how you might turn to a newsletter or a TikTok influencer for political news instead of legacy media. Alex, thanks so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, let me ask you about how the media covers elections. Now, the media these days is pretty fragmented. A lot of legacy media organisations are shrinking, but voters do have a lot of options for election coverage. So where are people turning to for their election coverage these days?
So I think people are turning away from traditional media. The biggest example I can see of that is the Washington Post. So the Washington Post has really struggled with subscribers. They've really struggled with business right now. They've lost a lot of subscribers. Their business model is struggling, and the Washington Post used to be the place to go for political coverage. Mm-hmm. During the Trump years and at the beginning of the Trump years, the Washington Post flourished because everyone was going there to get their political information. They wanted to see what the latest thing with Trump was. As the election ramped up, they wanted to hear about this candidate, that candidate, and what was going on. So them kind of losing ground in the world of political journalism just leads me to believe that people are seeking out info on TikTok, on Instagram, in newsletters. Like you mentioned, this fragmented media that is kind of all over the place. So people are going to the news outlets, unfortunately, that kind of match their biases. So they're going to like an influencer on TikTok who agrees with like how they feel about the world. And they're going to media platforms that kind of match their information consumption habits. So if I spend a lot of time, reading newsletters, that's where I'm going to get all my political coverage.
What kind of election coverage is useful for voters, and on the flip side of that, what isn't useful?
So now I'm revealing my biases because I work at Poynter, the home of PolitiFact, and I run, the MediaWise Teen Fact-Checking Network. But I still wholeheartedly agree that fact-checking is the most important and most impactful way to cover elections, because fact-checkers cut through all of the rhetoric, they cut through all of the culture war crap, and they get right to whether this policy that this politician is promoting works, whether the rhetoric that they're throwing around is legitimate or not. And so I think readers should be seeking out fact-checking. Now, unfortunately, fact-checking is not the sexiest type of political coverage. It just isn't. It can be dry because it is just the facts. Now, I will say fact-checkers are branching out. Like PolitiFact has a great presence on TikTok. They have a WhatsApp channel for Spanish users who speak Spanish, so they can send claims their way. But that is to me the most useful thing for voters.
It is challenging too because of the time delay in accurate fact checking, right? Like, it's one thing to make claims in real time, it's another thing to have the time to actually check out whether those claims match up or not.
Yeah, in the same way that politicians will disregard journalists and say, oh, that's fake news, they'll say the same thing about fact checkers. So fact checkers struggle with the time it takes to debunk something and the trust from voters that, I think the median voter is losing trust in journalism as a whole. So that's a big struggle there too as well.
One thing I've noticed, and I'm sure you're paying attention to this too because of where you are and what you do, is like a lot of these legacy media organizations and others as well are making fact-checking kind of part of, like, they're being very upfront about what they do and how that fits into the architecture of news, right? Before, you wouldn't necessarily go to great lengths to say, here's the fact-checking we did on this. Now you kind of have like a writer on stories saying, here's what went into the fact-checking behind this story, just to kind of give people a peek behind the curtain of how the journalism is done. Does that make a difference?
It does. It absolutely does. So my dream, the dream for me, and the thing that would be most helpful for voters is, one, if we could wave a magic wand and every community had a local newspaper. Two, if I wave that wand again and every one of those local newspapers had a fact checker on staff.
So your wand is basically a lot of money. It's an expensive wand.
It is. So if the press forward people are listening, that's where we really need help. Local news outlets are most helpful to voters. Fact checkers are most helpful to voters so that they can combine that. And that's the thing, when a voter, and I keep saying voter, but really news consumer, person, anyone, reads their local news, and that local reporter who they know is telling them, I collected the facts this way, I interviewed this person because of this, and then I checked this fact because of that, and this politician said that. So people gain trust. They are more trusting of journalists and reporters when they understand the work that went into it. So what we need is local papers in every community, fact checkers in every community.
We've talked a little bit on previous episodes or on other episodes in this series about the notion of emotions when it comes to political advertisements and kind of how politics is presented, and also horse race style coverage of politics. I think both of those things come to the forefront when you think about candidate debates. Has the coverage of debates changed? For example, when you think about fact-checking, how has that changed the way debates are covered by news organizations?
Well, it's funny. So when Ron DeSantis debated Gavin Newsom, at one point during the debate, Gavin Newsom went, all right, I cannot wait to hear the PolitiFact of that. So I think candidates know they're being fact-checked during these debates, and so I think candidates are very aware that what they say during these debates are going to be fact-checked. So in a way, fact-checkers have altered the way that people prepare for these debates, in a very good way. So I was very happy to hear about that. But I think because social media prioritizes these really short clips without context, you see candidates really more focused on like saying the thing that's going to go viral on TikTok. You know what I mean? So I think you see a lot more of these like little quips and, a lot of fighting because they want, they want something to go viral online. So there's kind of the good and the bad of coverage of these debates.
That was kind of an unusual debate too, because nobody asked for that debate, really, right? They're not running against each other. Oftentimes it's hard to get candidates who are running in the same race to debate each other. So this was like basically a prize fight.
It was bizarre. I enjoyed it personally because I'm a political junkie, and I thought it was very funny. I live in Florida, obviously. Yeah, they're not running against each other in anything. They'll probably be running for president, in years. But it was just an opportunity for them to get in front of each other and tee off on one another. And that's what a lot of debates have become. So
how can a voter identify if a media organization is reporting something accurately?
That's a really good question. I mean, if a media organization has a very strong editorial policy, which you can usually find like on their About Us page, if they have a really strong corrections policy, if they have a good reputation, then you can trust that what they're reporting is legitimate. I get a lot of pushback from teachers when I say this, but Wikipedia is actually a very good source to go to if you're unfamiliar with a news outlet that's reporting something. Wikipedia over the years has become a very legitimate source of information when you're starting research, but particularly if you get like a newsletter or you see a blog post that someone has shared and you don't know anything about who shared it, you can go to Wikipedia and find out, are they run by some biased think tank? Are they do they have controversies in the past? So what I would say is when it comes to like consuming news, it's always good to fact check the things that like a news outlet tells you if you're unfamiliar with it, but making sure you're consuming news from a reputable, good news site.
So what would you like to see more or less of from media outlets when it comes to election coverage?
Much less horse race journalism. I think it is very easy to chase clicks with presenting every single poll that comes out or every single thing that happens to a candidate.
Can I just play devil's advocate for a moment, though? Sometimes you do need some of that just to kind of get the people on the site to read the other stuff.
Exactly. No, that is a really good point. But maybe don't overdo it. This is what we could do an entire podcast on crime coverage at the local level, because like crime is not increasing in this country. In fact, it's decreasing. But local news outlets cover crime because it gets clicks.
Right. Look at the popularity of crime podcasts, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So the same thing goes with horse race journalism. I think it serves a purpose. You should be reporting on these polls. But if you make every single movement, every single event that happens about who's winning or who's losing, then you're not giving the voters anything. Deep investigative reporting we need more of, like what we've seen ProPublica do with the Supreme Court. I would hope to see lots of that about candidates. And then fact-checking. It always comes back to fact-checking with me, but more fact-checking, less horse race journalism.
And then just thinking, this is a final question, or final thought, I suppose, but just kind of thinking about meeting people where they're at. I mean, it's one thing to have deep investigative reporting. It can be tricky to read that on your phone or kind of condense it down to an Instagram Reels. So there's a little bit of a friction between what you're trying to do and how you're trying to present that, right?
Yeah, and that is the other thing that I would highly recommend and like to see more news outlets doing, is meeting people where they are. So having someone like Washington Post TikTok guy Dave Jorgensen, having someone like that at every paper who can take a big investigation, which he's done a lot at the Washington Post, and distill it down into a minute-long TikTok. He's had Woodward on his TikTok before, but I'd love to see more news outlets experimenting with vertical video to reach younger viewers with good information about candidates, so they can fill that vacuum that's usually filled by misinformation on Instagram and TikTok.
Well, Alex Mahadevan, Director of MediaWise at Poynter, thanks so much for sitting down with us and sharing your insights. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Alex Mahadevan is the Director of MediaWise at Poynter, and you can find more insights into the election on our Changing State podcast. Up next, how young voters are navigating this election season. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. And you're about to hear more insights from the Our Changing State podcast on how young voters can navigate this presidential election. It's election season, and if you're a new voter, it may be intimidating trying to decipher the flood of campaign ads, figure out your ballot, or even know who it is you're supposed to be voting for. There's good news. Whether this is your first election or you're new to voting in Florida, you still have time to get involved and have your say by voting. The deadline to register to vote for the general election is October 7th. Well, Tara Newsom, you teach political science and government at St. Petersburg College. Why should new voters in Florida care about this election or voting in general?
Young voters have this idea that they should be represented, and that's an idea that we all share. They've been underrepresented in almost all elections, usually 20 to 30 points behind the average voter. In this election, they recognize that democracy, their reproductive freedoms, climate change, foreign policies, all on the ballot. And so they're really leaning in and understanding they need to participate in the democratic process. They need to be represented. And they're also starting to understand the reality that they comprise 44% of the electorate. Gen Z and Gen Y are a large portion of the electorate, and they are starting to feel their own oats and want to make an impact.
How engaged in politics and civic life are your students?
A lot of students have sometimes this general pessimism or a malaise, and it's really they've lived through, in their experience, gun violence. They've lived through January 6th, the pandemic, and now, of course, the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And so, at times they don't want to participate because the conflict is almost overwhelming to them. And they're balancing all of those realities with their own life, their families, their children, working, going to school. But they're actually really starting to think, okay, I have to pay attention because this election, more than any other, is going to make an impact not only on my life, my community, and the whole worldview. And I did do a little focus group at the college. And of course, we're an open enrollment college. We have individuals that are anywhere from 17 to 70, all ethnicities. And really what was interesting is that they understood that how they vote in this election will determine whether or not they have, a World War III, whether they have access to bodily autonomy, or whether or not democracy will exist the way that we've known it.
What are your students telling you about this election?
Many of them are arguing to me that no one's paying attention to the issues that are most important to them, and that is the inflation, affordability. Do they have money to buy a house? Can they rent? Do they have money to buy milk and eggs and all of the food that they need for their families? And so it's the inflation. And then the second issue that they're most interested in, surprisingly, is foreign policy, is the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, and whether or not both sides can be honored and be afforded dignity. It seems to be very important to students. Now, right after that, students on both men and women start to begin to talk about abortion and what the state controlling the right to make choices over their body, their own health care, means to them. And it's really surprising. Both men and women are really big advocates of making sure that their vote is counted and that the state enshrines the right to choose.
So is this different from 2020 or 2022 even?
Really the enthusiasm and the inspiration that's happened since Joe Biden has stepped out of the race is much different than 2020 and 2022, of course. 2022, we saw very low voter engagement, not only from the youth vote, but from anybody, really. And 2020 was really coming out of the pandemic. It was an election that we've never seen before. Almost everyone in America voted by the mail-in ballot. Mm-hmm. But this is where I'm starting to see students really being inspired by the vision that they're seeing the campaigns really paint for them. Although both visions are two different Americas, it seems that students are very much inspired, enthusiastic, and almost really leaning into the process where in the past it seemed like they wanted to wash their hands of it.
So, say I'm a new voter. How do I even start to get involved in the political process? What do I do?
We certainly encourage our students to register to vote. The last day to register to vote for the November 5th election is October 7th. So that's the first step, right? The second step is to become an informed voter. And many of them understand the misinformation diet that's offered to them. They know that they need to watch for bias. They understand that social media isn't the only place for them to get their news. And so really we're encouraging our students to become robust curators of their own information. But we have students that are participating in civic life beyond that. They're volunteering. They're using their art as a form of expression. They are making sure that they show up for fellow community members who are in need. And so there's lots of ways to embrace civic life beyond voting, and we're seeing students really dive into those ways as well.
The social media piece is interesting, Tara, because last time we spoke to you, and this was during the 2022 election, you said that a lot of students get their information about politics and pretty much everything from social media. So if they're turning away from that, where are they going to for information?
Well, that's interesting. They still use social media to become informed, but they're more suspicious of it. They understand that it has a bias. They understand algorithms. They understand that piece of it. So we're really trying to encourage students to not only look at their social media, but to go ahead and look at places like NPR, of course, and all of our major cables channels, and to really even look at local news and to just have a diverse diet of information. That's the best that we can do, of course, because in our country, we don't necessarily have ways to regulate misinformation in journalism. So we really are encouraging them to do that information diet.
Now, if I don't want to get involved in a campaign or kind of get into the detail at that level, I can still be a savvy voter, right?
Absolutely. And that savvy voter really comes from consuming information from nonpartisan places. And there are lots of third-party organizations that we see that offer, if you vote yes on a ballot measure, it means this. If you vote no, and they're not, proselytizing, trying to tell you what to vote for, but they want you to be, critically thinking about what the impact of your vote is. So to be a savvy voter in 2024 really means that you are seeking out nonpartisan areas for your information and really trying to sit and think about the impact of that policy. One of the biggest things that we talk about with students and young voters is, what will the impact of you not voting be? What will that do to the democracy? And if you do vote, what will the impact? If yes, what will that look like for you, for your families, for your future? And I think students are really taking that to heart.
Now, it's not just a president and other candidates that you're being asked to choose on the ballot. There's also constitutional amendments that could have a big impact on people's lives too. Are your students thinking about those amendments?
Well, students are super excited about Amendment 3 and 4. With the 6 amendments, they're not necessarily, those are the citizen initiatives, they're not necessarily, riveted by whether homestead exemptions will have inflation attached to them or whether school board races should be partisan, although they are starting to understand that is a tactic for campaigns. Certainly here in Florida, we saw on both sides of the aisle that school board races were partisan and part of that ground game. But they are paying attention to, of course, recreational marijuana, in part not just because they want access to not necessarily be penalized from it. They want to interrupt the pipeline to prison that a lot of students see not only their friends and family go through, but other community members. And that by decriminalizing it, we'd interrupt that and they'd be able to go forward without having a felony conviction, which we know interrupts their ability to access apartments, getting a job, etc. So Amendment number 3 is really important to them. And certainly that tax base, I think many of them are thinking, will help cut the cost of higher ed. That's important to them because that's a big part of their budget. And Amendment number 4 being the right to reproductive freedom in the state of Florida, enshrining that in our state of Constitution, that's huge both for our male students and our female students. And that, of course, correlates with our polling that we're seeing all over the country, especially here in Florida, that shows that 69% of Floridians, whether Democrats, Republicans, or no party affiliate, support Amendment number 4. That seems to be reflected on the college campus, that this is a really important amendment for them. And it's not just abortion that they see it as. They see it as bodily autonomy. They see it as the state interfering in their own health care. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Everybody's got a sister, a brother, a sister, a daughter, a friend, someone that this is going to impact. And we certainly are seeing that students are worried about what that will look like if it doesn't pass.
Now, no party affiliation voters are a big part of the electorate in Florida. Is that a trend you're seeing with your students and with young voters in general?
When you select to be an NPA, you're really saying, I'm independent. I want to be different than what I see at the top of the ticket for the Republican Party or different than the top of the ticket for the Democratic Party. We're seeing that same commitment to being independent from these parties. We call it de-alignment in our student body. What's interesting about these individuals is that there are trends to watch in independent voters. Sometimes you can align independent voters to be more right, that they lean more right than not. In this election, I think we're going to really be watching, is that going to hold true? And the reason we're asking that question is because of the groundswell of support for Amendment number 4, the reproductive rights. So we're watching as academicians, are we going to see that independent voter lean right, or are they going to actually lean more left? And what consequence will that have for the Democratic Party? Will that actually pull more of those NPAs towards the top of the ticket for Kamala Harris and Walz and other candidates or not. And, there's a consequence to that. If only a few of those independent voters go to the Democratic Party, it could impact other races like, Rick Scott, who in the last election only won by 10,000 votes. And so these are razor-thin elections that those independent voters are going to be deciding. And if the support of Amendment 4 are any indicator, we might be seeing a whole new kind of trend.
I guess, those folks, those NPA voters, didn't have a lot to vote on during the August primary, right? But that's because Florida closes partisan races to those registered to a specific party. But is there a chance they'll want to get more engaged now?
Well, certainly we had races that those that are no party affiliate could have voted on in the primary.
School board,
school board example, supervisor of elections, and that kind of thing. But I really think that those young people out there that are in my campus and in my community, and I think in all of our shared community in Florida, are really paying attention to some of the shifts in their own lives that are really going to move them to the voting place. And those shifts are, yes, the economy is problematic. Yes, inflation is making it more difficult to go to school, have a home, eat healthy, etc. But now that we're starting to see inflation lowered, we're starting to see unemployment really be at an all-time low. I think these young voters are going to be freed up to start paying attention to issues of civil liberties, to the environment, to other things that might be important to them, but because they were so worried about just making sure they had a roof over their head and food in their bellies, they couldn't.
Let's loop back on that first question. Why should new voters care about this election, and what is the most important thing they can do to feel empowered when they get that ballot?
I think new voters know that they're important. I think they just have to have a moment to be able to express that. And having the economy improve, having unemployment improve is going to free them up to be able to engage. I think a lot of the sort of dark cloud that we see over young voters is that they're trying to make their lives in this environment that's highly charged with a lot of obstacles. But as those obstacles get freed up, I think you're going to start to see that this new young voter is going to flex and really make a difference in the outcomes in November.
Well, Tara Newsom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tara Newsom is a professor of government and civic learning at St. Petersburg College. She sat down to talk with WUSF's podcast, Our Changing State Vote 2024. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts and watch on YouTube. That's Florida Matters for this week. Grayson Doctor is the executive producer, engineering support from Jackson Harp. WUSF is here for you as Tropical Storm Helene approaches. Get the latest on 89.7 FM and WUSF.org. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.